Welcome to the 2018 to 2019 NCFCA webinar series. The goal of NCFCA webinars is to facilitate a platform where thought leaders and subject matter experts can provide insight on topics relevant to current debate resolutions and speech events. Our desire is to provide a platform that encourages mentorship, real-life application, and competitive excellence. Our intention for this webinar is to help provide educational context for the debate topic of international terrorism from our guest speaker's unique perspective and professional expertise. Please keep this framework in mind as you craft your questions and take advantage of the fact that you have an opportunity to interact with someone who can provide insight on the debate topic of reform of the United States federal government's foreign policy regarding international terrorism. The format for this evening's webinar will begin with a 30-minute presentation from the President of the King's College, Brigadier General Tim Gibson. This presentation will be hosted by a giveaway. It will be followed by a giveaway hosted by the King's College. And this giveaway will include a King's College tote bag, a tin mug, and King's College socks. So please do remember to submit your questions by utilizing the Q&A button that's available at the bottom of your screen. And we will be selecting 2 giveaway winners based on engagement with this Q&A segment, as well as 1 winner randomly. So following the giveaway, we will return with Brigadier General Gibson and Kim Cromer for a 15-minute live Q&A. And during this time, we'll respond to the questions that you have submitted throughout the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out in the chat box, and our webinar tech support team will be on the back end ready to help you in any way they can. At this point, it's my honor to invite our Executive Director, Kim Cromer, to join me on screen as I introduce her to you this evening. Our NCFCA host this evening is Kim Cromer. Kim and her husband of almost 25 years, Jeff, and their 3 daughters began their NCFCA journey in 2007. Since that time, they've lived in 4 different NCFCA regions and graduated all of their girls from high school. Kim holds a master's in human nutrition from Clemson University and taught biochemistry and physics both as an adjunct professor and as a high school science teacher. Her leadership experience crossed over into NCFCA, where she has served as Regional Director, Director of Forensics, and now Executive Director. So with that, thank you, Kim, for joining us, and I'm excited to turn this time over to you.
Thank you, Natalia. It's exciting to be here. It's my pleasure to join you and to host tonight's guest speaker, General Gibson, as you mentioned. He's currently serving as the president of our wonderful sponsor school, the King's College, in New York City, where we have a number of NCFCA alums who are having a great experience. So kudos, the King's College. We are pleased to have an opportunity tonight to interact with you all both as our partner and certainly as a subject matter expert. So with that, I'd like to invite General Gibson onto the screen with us while I tell you a little bit about his biography. Prior to his leadership at the King's College, General Gibson spent his career with the United States Air Force, where he commanded a variety of organizations, including as the installation commander of the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He was also the vice commander of the U.S. Air Force Expeditionary Center at Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, New Jersey, where the Air Force, Air Force Center for Excellence for Expeditionary Combat Support, Training, and Education. Wow, that's a mouthful. General Gibson received his commission through the Air Force Academy in 1988 and subsequently earned a master's degree in management from Colorado Christian University and a master's degree in Air Power Art and Science from the School of Advanced Air Power Studies at Maxwell Air Force Base. He retired in 2016 from the Air Force and became Executive Vice President of the King's College and Director for the Center of Leadership Development. In 2017, he became the acting president of the King's College, and in August of 2018 became the official president of the King's College, and now he's here with us. So we're excited to have you with us tonight, General Gibson.
Kim, thanks very much. It's
Sure.
it's fun to be here. All right, so would it be all right if I just jump right into some remarks, and then we'll let the rest of the evening unfold as was previously forecasted. I would say that yes, that job title from Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst is in fact a mouthful, and it was really tough to fit on a business card. So it was challenging in more than one way. Hey, it's really a privilege to join you all tonight. I would commend NCFCA for choosing such a substantive and relevant topic. As was mentioned, I graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1988 and became a pilot a year later in the Air Force and spent several years flying in the Air Force. And there was a point in my career very early on where things had unfolded in Iraq, and there was a concern for me. This is now, I think, 1990, 91, 92. And I was flying at that time as an instructor pilot at a pilot training base here in the continental United States. And there was a desert storm, and that unfolded. And I had several of my peers who I had graduated from the Air Force Academy with, who had flown in that conflict. I even had some students who were actively flying already that I had taught, and now were involved in sort of the tail end of those events. And I thought, my goodness, I went to the Air Force Academy, I went to pilot training, and unfortunately, I just missed what is essentially going to be the conflict of my generation, because over the course of time, if you look back at history, there was World War I, then World War II, then Korea, then Vietnam, and there was this sort of ebb and flow to conflict. And I was afraid that some of what I had aspired to do as a service member, as an Air Force pilot, was not going to be available. It was a rather short-sighted assessment, as it turns out, because several years later, although nobody certainly would have wanted that to have occurred, there had been some low-level terrorist incidents that were not as dramatic as certainly what 9/11 turned into, and then subsequently we have been fighting the global war on terror ever since. And so this is a topic that I spent almost 2 decades deeply involved in as an Air Force pilot, as an Air Force commander, sending several airmen downrange, having gone downrange many times myself, to include most recently in 2016. So I spent several months in the Middle East, certainly into and out of Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations in that part of the world. I share some of that with you to give you a perspective on where I'll be approaching the topic from. I am not a career academic, if you will. I am a practitioner. I am an Air Force pilot, so I'm going to come at this from a warfighter's perspective. I am going to share a little bit of how the Defense Department will think about terrorism policy, and hopefully that'll prompt some of the questions that we have an opportunity to engage with later. So the resolution is in and of itself somewhat limiting in scope, and that's a healthy thing. It really focuses on foreign policy, and it focuses on international terrorism. So we won't be addressing any U.S. policy with regard to domestic terrorism. The sanctions involved there, the entities that are involved from a policy implementation perspective are in many cases substantially different. And so it's very helpful to have that level of focus. So one of the challenges that the United States, and in fact the global community faces with regard to terrorism is simply a definition. How does one define terrorism? What qualifies under that definition, and what would be accepted from that definition? There have been studies conducted that over the course of time have revealed that there have been as many as more than 100 various definitions, nation to nation and over the course of time, that have been offered to try and define terrorism. Even within our own government, within the United States government, we struggle. Different departments, both two of which I'll highlight here momentarily, each have their own definition, and they're not quite the same. And so if I were to think deeply about potential reforms to U.S. policy, I might begin with that potential disconnect. So the first is found in Title 22 of the U.S. Code. Title 22 governs the responsibilities of our Department of State, so therefore our foreign relations and foreign policy. And in that Title 22, Chapter 38 of U.S. Code, terrorism is defined as the premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. That's useful from one perspective, but in the Code of Federal Regulations in Section 28, this is under the Department of Justice now. The first was under the Department of State. Under the Department of Justice, they define terrorism as the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. So right at the beginning, even at the most basic foundational rule of law level of the United States, we've got the potential for disconnect in terms of policy development and thus implementation of policy. So what I'll do from this point is talk a little bit from the Defense Department perspective on how policy or how law gets turned into policy, what the governing documents are for that, and a little bit about what is involved in those current governing documents. And then we'll get down to the level of where this comes down to the implementation piece of this. So from the law, the President of the United States will craft a national security strategy. And the current national security strategy includes 4 pillars. The pillar most relevant for the discussion this evening is listed as protect the American people, the homeland, and our way of life. And specifically, as that applies to the concern of the evening of international terrorism, there are some relevant factors that are included in the national security strategy. The first is pursue threats to their source, and they explicitly highlight defeat jihadi terrorists and dismantle transnational criminal organizations. So what we find in actuality is that in many cases, the interests, the vulnerabilities, the enabling characteristics that allow both a terrorist operation to thrive and that of a transnational criminal organization tend to be coincident. And so it makes sense that as we're thinking through policy and the implementation or execution of that policy, that we would consider those two elements together, international terrorism and transnational criminal organizations. Once the President publishes the national security strategy, each of the cabinet level officials will then analyze that national security strategy and respond with a document about how they intend to implement the policy guidelines from the strategy into their department. And so from my perspective as a U.S. airman, the relevant department, of course, would be the Defense Department, and the Secretary of Defense would publish the National Defense Strategy. The National Defense Strategy will highlight how the Defense Department will plan to approach essentially the go-dos that come down from the National Security Strategy. And the most current National Defense Strategy lists 3 approaches from the Defense Department. One is build a more lethal force. The second is strengthen alliances and attract new partners. And the third is reform the department for greater performance and affordability. Now, it's interesting to start to look at the characteristics of that policy and some of the language that is evident and is manifest later in the document. You'll see things in the National Defense Strategy, for example, about focus and about attracting partnerships. From there, you'll see those things replicate themselves deeper into the implementation. The next level in the Department of Defense then that has a strategic policy requirement to respond is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the chairman is responsible for publishing something called the National Military Strategy. It's required to be published every 2 years and updated and refreshed. The chairman works in collaboration with the geographic combatant commanders and those responsible for the agencies that contribute to our effectiveness as a military, such as the Director of National Intelligence. The National Military Strategy very quickly ends up being a classified document, and therefore wouldn't be available for the policy analysts to be able to look at outside of that classification. But in general, the two characteristics of the current National Military Strategy are power projection, that is, how quickly can the U.S. military forces respond and operate out of a new geographic region. And the second is to increase partnerships with allied nations. And so we start to see a trend and consistency in the nesting of the policy guidelines that are relevant for how we seek to address the challenges posed by international terrorism. Now, interestingly, there is a very recently published document that is exceptionally relevant in this particular context. So just last month, in October of 2018, the White House, under the President's signature, published the National Strategy for Counterterrorism. So this is a very focused policy document. This one is expressly designed to address the specific challenges of the topic that you all are considering, and I think might be an extremely rich document for you to carefully read through and analyze. I see several things already in it that I think would be debatable, and beginning right with the end states and some of the methodologies through which those end states would likely be achievable. Some of the things that I'll highlight just to pique your interest, and then I'll let you all ask questions more deeply as we go later. One of the efforts, or one of the statements that's in that National Security for Counterterrorism document is, we'll not dilute our counterterrorism efforts by attempting to be everywhere all the time. We are going to optimize and focus based on the threat posed to the homeland and vital national interests. And what the document doesn't do is get extremely explicit about the geographic region referred to as the homeland, or defining vital national interests. So there's still quite a lot of what I would think of as wiggle room, if you will, with regard to the policy. It does, however, do a really nice job of breaking out what's referred to as priority actions. And so in a subsection of that document, pursue terrorist threats to their source, you'll see priority actions such as target key terrorists and groups, enhance reach into denied areas overseas, which should sound familiar from the National Military Strategy and power projection that I just mentioned. Effectively use the law of armed conflict in our detention practices. Further integrate the federal, state, local, and information sharing entities, and then use strategic communications to our advantage, both to counter the ideological messages that are being put out and to create a more resilient community, both in terms of partner nations and in potential recruits for terrorist entities. And when push comes to shove, what we need to think about is how do these policies then actually become implemented? And in terms of a traditional approach to international or foreign relations, we used to think in terms of 4 elements of national power. Those are the diplomatic realm, the informational realm, the military component, and the economic component. Each of these offered a certain amount of influence in a nation-to-nation context that would allow pressure to be placed either through one of those elements of national power or through a combination. So it may be a situation where economic pressure could be brought to bear. You might think of things such as sanctions that would come to mind on particular nation states. Certainly, military force can in fact be used, although that would be something that we would hesitate to lead with unless there was a particularly egregious conflict that we needed to address very, very quickly. Frankly, diplomacy is something that that U.S. and the State Department will, via the State Department, will engage in all the time. There's very, very few times where I can't think of a time where we would not be a part of some diplomatically relevant effort. The challenge that we face now with even in the definitions that I mentioned earlier is that we're not talking about a nation-to-nation conflict at this point. We're talking about a nation engaging with what is referred to as a sub-national group or clandestine agent, according to the Foreign Relations Act. And so they've expanded, or we have expanded, how we think about the instruments of national power. So while we still respect and think through the traditional elements of national power, again, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, we've now moved to integrate financial, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies. And so one of the dramatic shifts after 9/11 was a desire for a very integrated approach whereby we're able to share intelligence that's relevant between agencies, whereby we're able to partner with law enforcement and military. And that's a very careful line to walk when it comes to the authorities between civilian or Title V versus Title 22 versus Title 10 forces, which would be the military forces that I was a part of for so long. But the integration of all of those elements of national power in a much more deliberate way, whereby we might do some analysis based on following trails of money, quite frankly, where the Department of the Treasury may have a particular insight that is relevant, that leads to a diplomatic outreach, that might lead to be bolstered by an economic sanction, which could be implemented in any number of ways through cyber or through intelligence means. When we're able to integrate all of those things, we have a much better chance of having a holistic solution to address the threat posed by a subnational organization that isn't just going to come to the bargaining table at the UN, for example. I think at this point, what I'd like to do is just highlight one last thing, and I'll finish with this, and then I'll ask Tyler to come over and go into the giveaways. I will tell you that not only are the King's socks something that are highly sought after, but Tyler himself is modeling those for us today. So you might give him kudos for that. He puts his money where his mouth is, as it were. Anytime we're talking about a terrorist threat, there are two elements that we're always very concerned about. And in fact, this works from a nation-to-nation perspective as well, but that's beyond the scope of the conversation. One is the ability of a terrorist act. So do they actually have a credible threat? Do they have the capability necessary to cause harm? And then the second piece is the intent. Do they actually have the intent to threaten the United States or our interests abroad. And so one way to think about this in a very simplistic term would be, certainly there are nations that are outside the United States that have very effective military capabilities. Let's think about the United Kingdom, for example. However, there's no intent to harm any of the interests of the United States there. So ability by itself is not a particular concern or threat. There are others that would have intent to cause harm to the United States, but have no actual ability there. And so, again, the threat assessment would be, that's not someplace that you would really spend too many heartbeats thinking about or trying to target, if you will, from a policy perspective. So it's that combination of ability and intent that needs to be assessed. And then if you're able to unhinge either of those or weaken either of those, then of course the threat is mitigated and can be addressed that way. So hopefully that gives you all something of an overview of U.S. policy towards international terrorism, gives you a sense of how law becomes policy and then even becomes analyzed more deeply into the implementation of that policy. And then a couple of ideas about how a credible threat is assessed or addressed. And so with that, I'll stop there. I'm going to ask Tyler to step into frame now and take care of a little bit of important business, and then we'll come back for some of the Q&A. Tyler?
Perfect. Thanks so much, President Gibson. I think this is probably one of the first webinars hearing such a thorough foundation on a lot of things behind a lot of the policy. So definitely really loving hearing that. Yeah, I want to just tell you guys a little bit about the swag that we're going to be giving away today. Nothing like some good college gear. So I'll show these off in just a second, but also just wanted to give a small bit of background about the King's College. Obviously, you're seeing our banner. These things all have our brand on them, but what exactly does that mean? What is the King's College? Who are we? So just a brief little bit about us. We're a Christian college. We're located in the financial district in New York City, so right in the heart of the city. And we are, a classical great book school founded on the liberal arts. All of our majors kind of intersect with that. And I would say as colleges differentiate from each other, one thing that makes King's unique is just our roots in the politics, philosophy, and economics. That's our common core here at the college. It's something that every student interacts with day to day and looks at tackling those bigger questions that some schools will slip over, but that King's really focuses in on for the students before moving on to your given field of study. So majors here at King's look like media, culture and the arts, business, really the different spheres of influence that exist in New York City that partner well with the opportunity that exists here. But alongside all of those is that rooting in politics, philosophy, and economics, which is also something that I know is near and dear to a lot of NCFCA students' hearts as well. So yeah, I would love to hear from you guys if you have any questions about the school. But without further ado, so we have 3 pieces today that we'll be sending out to you guys. The first one here is a King's mug. So it's got actually one of the older logos from the school on it there. So got this mug, the King's tote bag, which you guys will see and definitely be jealous of whoever gets that. And like President Gibbs said, I'm wearing the King's socks here. Just gotta show you. The only way to prove it. Here's the King's socks, which has our logo on it as well, and it's definitely a great piece of swag. So we'll be giving away those to some of the most engaged members during today's webinar, as well as a really selected one. So yeah, without further ado, we can move on to some of those questions. I believe Kim is going to come back on here and sort through those. Thanks again, President Gibson. Definitely a real honor.
All right. So Kim, I think it's over to you at this point.
Absolutely. That sounds great. And Tyler, Natalia and I were having a background conversation about whether or not you might actually autograph the socks that you're going to send out.
We're just going to make sure he sends out the clean new pair.
That's probably a good idea. Thank you so much. All right. Well, let's jump right into the questions, because what you're going to find, General Gibson, is that our kiddos are really engrossed in the topic and are very interested in what you have to share tonight, both in your presentation and for some of their specific questions.
Okay.
So we'll start. We've kind of classified them in a couple of different categories, and the first one is about the definitions that you mentioned. And the first question is, why are the definitions of international terrorism so different, and what considerations should we employ to choose the most credible one in order to use it for a debate round?
Yeah. So I love the idea of looking at it right from the most foundational element. And it is quite a challenge to be discerning about the policy implications based on the definitions that are in use. And so it's a very challenging question to answer. As I said, over the last probably 100, 150 years, because terrorism is quite frankly not a new phenomenon.
Right.
There have been more than 100 different definitions that have been tried. And in fact, even at the presidential cabinet level, there was a study done not long ago in which there were 5 very specific formulations of a definition of terrorism for use holistically across the United States departments. And what was found was that based on the interpretation of the words within the definition, you could even come back to the conclusion that the United States itself had acted or engaged in terrorist activity. And so that becomes something that it's just untenable for us to say, well, we're going to hold an outside entity to a standard that we're not willing to hold ourselves. But it's always based around the interpretation of a particular definition of terrorism. And so I think what has evolved, and I've never served at the presidential cabinet level, of course, but we needed to have a definition that was appropriate for the context in which each of these departmental activities would unfold. And so for the Foreign Relations Act, for the State Department, diplomacy and negotiation and bargaining and those types of activities are the predominant form of power and form of banter or back and forth between other nations. And so the definition is appropriate for that context. The Department of Justice, however, and this is specifically under the section that addresses the responsibilities of the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. There is much more of a law enforcement bent to that definition. We're looking for a definition that enables us to say this behavior is in fact in violation of federal law, and the sanction, the consequence to that is going to be imprisonment or something that is a judicially arrived at sanction. For the military, that's typically not the approach that the United States military active duty wasn't built with the intent of law enforcement, for example. And so hence there's a completely different part of the U.S. Code that governs the activity of active duty forces. Title 10, again, is the code that governs that. But it is another means of national power. So I'm not sure that I've got a great clarifying answer for that question. That's a tough one. But I do think it gives you a rich avenue for debate.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that certainly is one of the things that our students spend a lot of time doing, is learning to define their terms so that they can actually debate on the same level, as opposed to two ships passing in the night, which we often see in in the real world, don't we?
No,
okay, so the next question we have in terms of definitions is, what would you say is a national interest? And by that, we're sort of assuming that the question really was getting at whether or not the national interest, what considerations we would have in terms of fighting certain terrorist groups. Does it benefit our country to fight groups that haven't directly harmed us, at least yet?
Yeah, okay, so that is a great question. So let me start with talking about a national interest. So there are going to be a wide array of things that nations are going to identify for themselves as national interests. The context is going to matter a great deal. If you're a European nation with other sovereign powers all around you on your borders, you're going to have national interests that are a little bit distinct from the United States, for example, who we enjoyed for a very long time the great barriers of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and in many ways that was quite a benefit to us in terms of the ability for an adversary to reach out and touch us, if you will. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to pause for a second and say that there are some national interests that most nations are going to agree are in fact common. So one would be the sovereignty of the form of government would be one thing that it would be considered a national interest. If a particular nation chooses to be a democratic republic, it should be respected as much as a country that chooses another form of governance. A socialist foundation, for example, might be another alternative to that. Sovereign borders that are agreed upon and respected would be another commonly discernible national interest. But one of the things that I want to highlight, and I don't want to get too nitpicky, but this is a debate league, right? So let me get nitpicky just for a second. The key point here is not national interest, but vital national interest, and the adjective matters in that a vital national interest could be perceived to be an existential threat to your way of life, and so I think the challenge here is, okay, so how do you interpret that? So let me give you an example. We have throughout the world areas that we would refer to as the global commons. So some of those global commons would be things like shipping lanes through which large movements of goods flow. So the Straits of Malacca is one of those areas in the region near China. The Straits of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, these are areas that would be considered global commons because of the flow of goods and commerce through those areas. Airspace could be considered and lumped into global commons. And in fact, there are agreements about the segments of outer space just outside the atmosphere and which nations have what segments of space. These areas, depending on the nation, could be considered vital national interest. Now, the question that many of you should be thinking about as extremely relevant, not just for this topic, but also for your future, is, does cyberspace count as a global common?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great tips for them to think about that. All right, let's move into policy.
Okay.
No surprise there that they think about policy questions. So what's your opinion on signature drone strikes, and are they more effective or faster to use than targeted killings?
Signature drone strikes versus targeted killings. Let's see, how do I approach this? From a warfighter's perspective, we are there to implement policy. And in fact, If you go back to Clausewitz, you'll read that war is simply policy through another means.
Mm-hmm.
If in fact the most appropriate way of engaging a particular target is via a drone strike, then it makes great sense to do. And so one of the things that's extremely important to the U.S. way of warfare, and in fact the way our policies are implemented, is that law of armed conflict.
Mm-hmm.
We hold that very, very dear. You can trace the roots all the way back to St. Augustine. You can see in which areas of that law of armed conflict or just war theory, things that we want to consider in large measure that manifest in what we would call the rules of engagement. And the rules of engagement in my world is a very specific set of criteria through which a warfighter is authorized to engage an enemy target. And if we're doing that, it's with lethal intent. And so it's not a decision that we make lightly. It's not a decision that we make quickly. But before a strike of that type is authorized, there is an analysis of the appropriate use of force, whether or not the target is in fact legitimate, and who or what we think it is. We've got to have a very high degree of confidence that that is in fact the case, that the weapon that is about to be employed is in fact going to be effective against that particular target, and then a collateral damage assessment. Who or what might be injured or harmed in the vicinity is always a criteria. And so it's something that a terrorist organization will often use as against us. I had a colleague who was a judge advocate general, and he would refer to it as lawfare. And the reason he used that was that what we would find is that sometimes potential targets, terrorists, would hide in plain sight, if you will, in a crowd, because they knew we weren't going to try to attack them with a high risk of collateral damage, or that they would set up an area that was perhaps in a mosque or a church, someplace that we would be on our off limits list in terms of a strike. And so we're very deliberate about trying to honor that law of armed conflict. We're not just there to win at all costs. We're there to win in a way that minimizes the loss of life, that absolutely only affects the intended target, so that we can not only just win the conflict, but we can win the peace that follows beyond the conflict.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Insightful. Next question. What's your opinion on the effectiveness of the International Military Education Training Program?
Yeah. So IMET, the International Military Education Training Program. So this is a program through which the United States government engages with foreign governments, particularly with military education and training. So as the name would imply, of course. Some areas where we've seen great success with IMET type activities would include South and Central America. We have nations that we would refer to as a net importer of military training and a net exporter of military training. And so in South America, for example, what we would see through a plan, what was called Plan Colombia, because of terrorist threats, in that case specifically the FARC, the combination of terrorist threats with transnational networks, in this case drug smuggling and human trafficking, Colombia was an area that at one time was only safe in the city of Bogota, the capital of it itself, and the Colombian people finally got pretty frustrated with the fact that they could not really go anywhere outside their own capital safely, and partnered with the United States. At that time, they were a net importer of military training and education. However, through Plan Colombia, which has been remarkably successful, Colombia today is much the opposite. They're a net exporter of security standards and training. And what we've seen is other nations in South and Central America are much more likely to approach Colombia and ask for help and training than they are to approach the United States. And that's simply a matter of cultural alignment, of language in some cases, and we're fine with that. We do not want to be the world's police force trying to enforce the rule of law everywhere. We would much rather support other nations as they organically address concerns within their own border, and in fact can partner in their own region to enhance what are in fact common goods. A common good in this case would be the elimination of drug trafficking, the elimination of human trafficking. And so IMET is a program that allows us to do some of that. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that we find frequently, and this is very different than the U.S. military, but in many nations, the rise of high-ranking military officials is not as much based on skill or meritocracy, but is often associated with heredity or who your family is. And so by doing training and engaging with officers at the younger point in their career, we often find that if we can bring them to a U.S. school and they turn out to be the chief of staff of their Air Force at some point, for example, it turns out to be a very influential partnership. I experienced that myself as an instructor pilot in the KC-135 air refueling tanker with a student pilot who then later went on to become the chief of staff of the Singaporean Air Force. But now he's not just the chief of staff of the Air Force, he's also a friend and ally.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wow. All right, so going on to another policy. One common attack on counterterrorism policy is the 2001 AUMF that was instituted immediately after 9/11. What's your perspective on this policy and how can it best be fixed?
You know, there's so many things that were reactionary after 9/11.
Sure.
It was quite a blow, obviously, to us as a nation. It is far and away the largest loss of life that due to a terrorist incident it certainly affected the United States. And so there were policies that were implemented that were themselves a crisis response and perhaps locked things down or became more restrictive than were potentially necessary. I'll give you an example. One of the things that happened at the United States Air Force Academy, for example, is there was a policy that was implemented from the commander of U.S. Northern Command across all military installations that they would be locked down and no civilian access authorized for a particular amount of time. And that policy was in effect for an extraordinarily long time. But in an installation such as the United States Air Force Academy, which is also in itself a four-year liberal arts college, there are other considerations that impact the mission of that installation. So there's a recruiting element. It turns out the most frequently visited man-made tourist attraction in the state of Colorado is the Air Force Academy Chapel. There are things such as football games and basketball games and hockey matches and things along those lines. Mm-hmm. And so I had to work with the commander of U.S. Northern Command, and in fact had to go back every 90 days to get a waiver to policy that was in fact what was perceived to be an appropriate restriction in place following the terrorist attacks of 9/11. But over the course of time, if you put the right mitigating factors or mitigating measures into effect, you can in fact back off on some of those policies, in my opinion. And so for the student who asked that question, what I would really be discerning about and think carefully through is what is the risk that policy is intended to mitigate? And then what are alternatives to mitigating that risk that are not as onerous as the policy that you're considering? If you get at the interest that's behind a thing, you don't have to attack the position itself. So the policy can be, in fact, adapted, but the underlying interest, the mitigation of risk and response, is what needs to be addressed.
Okay, very good. Great suggestion there. All right, so the next question is a little more general. In what situations should the U.S. more effectively use detention?
In what situations should the U.S. more effectively use detention?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, so this is another topic that has been hotly debated after 9/11. It has a lot to do with detention facilities that were not within the bounds of the United States, of course, and the rationale for that was often affiliated with the rules or the treatment of detainees. In fact, there was great debate about can we call them detainees, or do we call them prisoners of war? If this is a global war on terror, why are they not therefore prisoners of war? But if you start to use language like that, now you'd be held to account for things such as the Geneva Accords and the treatment of prisoners of war, which, interestingly enough, the United States follows very, very carefully, but it's not a signatory to the Geneva Accords officially. Mm-hmm. So the appropriate use of detention. If there is a disruption to a terrorist threat, I think that's an appropriate use of detention, right? I think that we used detention very effectively, right, immediately after 9/11, as we identified those who were involved in that scheme, if you will, in that plot, and through the means of interrogation, we're able to discern other actors or other interested parties who were a part of that, and it's very, very difficult to untangle the web that the terrorist organizations will form. In many cases, through their use of cyber, and particularly the dark web. And so it becomes exceptionally challenging to identify who actors are, what their level of sincerity, and what the threat actually is. Again, I'd go back to that idea of there has to be both ability and intent. There are some that will talk a big game, if you will, mm-hmm. but really don't have much intent behind it. There are others who in fact have both, and they're particularly nefarious, and they're extremely good at avoiding detection, and in fact adapting their identities, adapting their locations. Mm-hmm. It makes it extremely challenging. So detention is appropriate if there is particularly if there's an ability to disrupt a thing. But at the end of the day, if the threat is analyzed accurately, if the subject is identifiable, and we are in fact able to confirm, I still unfortunately think that there is a time for the use of lethal force.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so we'll wrap up with one final overarching question that you're going to love.
All right.
So based on your military experience, what's your perspective on the success of the war on terror? And from a policy standpoint, should we move forward or should we pull backwards?
Sorry, Kim, you kind of cut out there for just a second. Let me rephrase the question for you and see if I heard it correctly.
Okay.
My understanding was, from my military perspective, do I feel like our policies with regard to international terrorism are appropriate and we should continue to move forward, or are inappropriate and we should pull back?
Generally speaking, yes, that was the question.
Okay, generally. So is that a pun?
Yes.
Yeah. In this case, yeah. So generally speaking, I would say we are making progress. We have not experienced another event that is nearly as catastrophic as 9/11. That said, we know that there are actors out there that do in fact have the intent to do the United States and its allies harm. There is absolutely no room to debate that those folks are out there. And if they are able to procure the means, or they can be able to procure the ability to follow through on that malintent, they will do so. There are forces that are just agents of chaos, and they would like nothing better than to establish that global caliphate, for example. And they would be eager to enforce their view of theology, their view of governance, and it would be a dramatic step backward for Western civilization in particular, if those actors were able to reach out and follow through on those ideas. So no, I don't think we should pull back. I think we should do everything we can to strike that balance, and there are no easy answers here, but that balance in our interest of having an open and free and democratic society, and the need for a federal government, in fact state and local governments as well, to police well and be discerning in their actions to protect their citizens.
Wonderful. General Gibson, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for what you all are doing there at the King's College. We're excited about our relationship and our partnership together. Thank you for taking care of so many of our alums while they're there with you all. I know they're having a great time, and we love hearing about that. So thank you again for all you're doing for us.
You're very welcome. Thanks very much. This has been
For sure. We're going to invite Tyler back because I think he's going to name our giveaway folks tonight.
Yes, I have the pleasant job of announcing the winners. So for the King's Mug, Emma Beagle, they've been awarded that. Mindy Husband for the tote bag, and then Logan, you won the awesome King Socks. So congrats to you guys. Thank you so much for your involvement in today's webinar and for tuning in. And for those who came in late or missed this opportunity, we'll definitely have that recording for you as well.
Wonderful. Very good. Thank you again to the King's College.
Yes, thank you so much for hosting us. And again, if you have any questions about the college or would like even to follow up with General Gibson, I'm sure we'd be happy to talk to you guys. So please reach out.
Wonderful. Very good. Natalia, I'll invite you back to close us out.
All right. Well, thank you again to the King's College, to Tyler and General Gibson for investing your time and expertise with us this evening. I know the students and parents have been very appreciative of all that you shared, as was demonstrated through their engaging questions. So with that, I just wanted to give a brief reminder to our students that our final team policy webinar of 2018 will be this Monday, November 12th at 6 p.m. Central. And this webinar is going to differ from our previous team policy webinars, which have been topic-based, because our webinar on Monday is actually going to be with debate committee members Ravi Paul and Christy Scheip. They will be discussing the framework, strategy, potential pitfalls, and some encouragement for team policy debate this season. So definitely join us. If you haven't saved your seat already, do so and spread the word to your friends and members of club. So with that, thank you for joining us. We look forward to another year of learning and growing in integrity with you this competition season. Have a wonderful evening.